The words hung in the desert air like a death sentence, each syllable cutting deeper than any blade could reach. Clara's tears fell onto the dusty ground of her father's ranch, mixing with the Texas earth that had already claimed too much of her blood, too many of her dreams. "I was promised to another," she whispered again, as if saying it might make the nightmare real, might make her heart stop its rebellious beating. But Jacob Reed stood there like a force of nature, his weathered hands steady, his dark eyes burning, with something that made her forget every lesson about propriety her mother had ever taught her. The wind carried the scent of sage, and something wilder. Freedom, perhaps, or the dangerous promise of a life unchosen. Subscribed to witness a love that could destroy everything they've ever known. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dawson ranch, but Clara felt only the chill of her father's words, echoing in the parlor where her fate had been decided, without her voice, without her heart. She stood at the window of her bedroom, watching the endless expanse of Texas prairie stretch toward a horizon that seemed to mock her with its freedom. Her reflection in the glass showed a young woman in a blue dress that cost more than most families saw in a year, but the fabric felt like a shroud, beautiful and suffocating. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light, a diamond as cold and lifeless as the man who would soon claim her as his wife. Thomas Whitmore was a good man, her father insisted, a man of property and standing who would secure the Dawson legacy for generations to come. But Clara had seen the way he looked at her, like she was another piece of land to be acquired, another asset to be managed and controlled. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the dusty road that wound through their property, and she watched as a lone rider approached the main house. Even from a distance, there was something different about this man, the way he sat his horse with easy confidence, the way he seemed to belong to the wild landscape rather than fight against it. Her heart began to beat faster, though she couldn't understand why. The rider dismounted near the stables, and Clara found herself pressing closer to the window, trying to catch a glimpse of his face. When he turned toward the house, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow, she saw features carved by sun and wind, eyes that held depths she had never seen in any man's gaze. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with fine clothes or social standing, handsome in the way a thunderstorm was beautiful, dangerous, and untamed. Her mother's voice calling from downstairs broke the spell, and Clara reluctantly turned away from the window. "Clara, dear, come down. Your father wants to discuss the wedding arrangements." The words fell like stones into the quiet of her room, each one a reminder of the cage that was closing around her. She smoothed her skirts and checked her appearance in the mirror, practicing the smile she would need to wear, the mask of the dutiful daughter who accepted her fate with grace. But as she descended the stairs, her mind kept returning to the stranger in the yard, to the way he had looked at the vast sky as if it belonged to him, as if he had never known the weight of other people's expectations. The parlor felt smaller than usual, crowded with her parents' plans and her own growing desperation. Her father, William Dawson, stood by the fireplace with the bearing of a man who had built an empire from nothing and expected the world to bend to his will. Her mother, Margaret, sat primly on the velvet sofa, her hands folded in her lap like a lady in a painting, beautiful and still and somehow already dead. They spoke of guest lists and flower arrangements, of the merger that would unite two of the largest ranches in Texas, of the grandchildren who would carry on the Dawson name. Clara nodded and smiled, and felt pieces of her soul crumble with each decision made without consulting her heart. When her father mentioned that they had hired additional hands for the ranch, including a man with excellent references from Colorado, she found herself asking his name before she could stop herself. "Jacob Reed," her father replied, his attention already returning to the papers spread across his desk. "Comes highly recommended. We'll need good men if we're going to expand the operation after your marriage." The name settled into Clara's chest like a secret, like a prayer she didn't yet know how to say. She excused herself from the parlor, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie, and returned to her room where she could watch the stranger, Jacob, as he worked with the horses in the corral below. There was poetry in the way he moved, a rhythm that spoke of long days under open skies and nights spent counting stars instead of counting money. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and wondered what it would feel like to touch a man who belonged to himself, who answered to no one but the wind and his own wild heart. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She would find a way to speak to Jacob Reed, to learn what freedom looked like in a man's eyes, even if it meant risking everything she had been taught to value. The diamond on her finger felt heavier than ever, but for the first time since her engagement had been announced, she felt something stronger than despair. She felt the dangerous, intoxicating possibility of choice. 3 days passed before Clara found the courage to venture beyond the carefully manicured gardens that surrounded the main house. 3 days of watching Jacob from her window and feeling her carefully constructed world crack a little more with each glimpse of his untamed grace. She told herself she was simply taking a walk to clear her head, that her path toward the stables was coincidental, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for flight. The afternoon heat shimmered off the dusty ground, and she could hear the sound of hammer against metal coming from the blacksmith shed, where Jacob was repairing a broken bridle. She paused in the shadow of the barn, suddenly uncertain, suddenly aware that she was about to cross a line from which there might be no return. When she finally stepped into the shed, Jacob looked up from his work, and the world seemed to stop spinning on its axis. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, grey and green and full of lightning, and when they met hers, Clara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice rough as whiskey and twice as intoxicating. "Is there something you need?" The question hung between them, loaded with meanings neither of them dared to speak aloud. Clara found herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the way his shirt clung to his shoulders, the calluses on his hands that spoke of honest work and a life lived without apology. She had never been alone with a man like this, had never felt the air itself become electric with possibility and danger. "I wanted to thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "for the work you've been doing. My father says you're the best horseman he's ever hired." And it was a lie wrapped around a truth. She cared nothing for her father's opinion of Jacob's work, but she needed some excuse to be here, some reason that wouldn't reveal the chaos he had unleashed in her carefully ordered world. Jacob set down his tools and stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his storm-colored eyes. "Your father's a good man," he said carefully, "but I get the feeling you didn't come here to talk about horses." The words sent heat racing through her veins, and Clara felt her cheeks burn with a blush that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. "I'm getting married," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out like a confession. "In 6 weeks. To Thomas Whitmore." She watched Jacob's face for some reaction, some sign that the news affected him the way his presence affected her, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Congratulations," he said, though something flickered in his eyes that might have been disappointment or might have been relief. "He's a lucky man." The polite words felt like a slap, and Clara found herself stepping closer, driven by a desperation she didn't fully understand. "I don't love him," she whispered, the admission hanging between them like a challenge. "I've never loved anyone. I don't even know what love feels like." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields and the whisper of wind through the barn rafters. Jacob's hands clenched at his sides, and Clara could see the war being fought behind his eyes, duty against desire, wisdom against want. "Miss Dawson," he said finally, his voice strained, "you should go back to the house. This isn't proper." But even as he spoke the words, he didn't step away, didn't break the invisible thread that seemed to connect them across the small space of the shed. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, tears of frustration and longing, and the terrible knowledge that she was about to lose something she had never even had the chance to claim. "I was promised to another," she said, the tears finally spilling over, running down her cheeks like liquid silver in the dim light of the shed. The words were meant to be an explanation, an apology, a goodbye, but they came out sounding like a plea. Jacob's careful control finally cracked, and he reached out to brush the tears from her face with fingers that trembled despite their strength. "I don't care," he growled, his voice raw with everything he had been trying to hold back. "I don't care about promises or propriety, or what's proper for a lady like you. I care about the way you look at the horizon like you're searching for something you've lost, the way you stand at your window watching the world like you're trapped behind glass." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and Clara felt her world tilt and reshape itself around this moment, this touch, this man who saw her in ways no one ever had. The kiss that followed was inevitable as sunrise, desperate as drought-breaking rain, and when their lips met, Clara understood for the first time what it meant to be truly alive. Jacob's arms came around her, pulling her against the solid warmth of his chest, and she could feel his heart beating as wildly as her own. The taste of him was like freedom itself, dangerous and sweet, and absolutely forbidden. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara knew that everything had changed, that there was no going back to the girl she had been just moments before. "What have we done?" she whispered against his lips, but even as she asked the question, she was already reaching for him again, already addicted to the fire he had lit in her blood. Escrivá os capítulos 3 to 5. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dawson ranch as Clara stood at her bedroom window, watching Jacob work with the horses in the distant corral. Her fingertips still burned from his touch, and every breath seemed to carry the memory of his whispered words against her skin. The white cotton of her nightgown felt foreign against flesh that had been awakened to sensations she never knew existed. Her father's voice echoed from the kitchen below, discussing wedding preparations with her mother, each word falling like stones into the well of her stomach. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching Jacob's powerful frame move with fluid grace as he gentled a wild mustang, and wondered if she was losing her mind or finally finding her soul. The breakfast table felt like a tribunal, with her parents seated across from her like judges preparing to deliver a sentence. Her mother's delicate china clinked against the silence as she poured coffee, the sound sharp and accusatory in Clara's ears. "Mr. Whitmore will be arriving this afternoon to finalize the arrangements," her father announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality that had governed Clara's entire life. "You'll wear the blue dress, the one with the pearl buttons." Clara's hand trembled as she reached for her cup, the simple act of drinking coffee suddenly requiring all her concentration. Through the window, she could see Jacob leading the horses to pasture, his hat tilted against the morning light, and she felt her heart fracture a little more with each step that carried him further away. The hours crawled by like wounded animals, each minute stretching into an eternity of anticipation and dread. Clara found herself wandering the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects that suddenly felt foreign beneath her fingers. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with the rhythm of a funeral march, marking time until her fate would be sealed with signatures and handshakes. She paused before the mirror in the parlor, studying the face that stared back at her, still young, still unmarked by the weight of compromise, but already beginning to show the shadows of a woman who understood the price of duty. Her reflection seemed to mock her with its innocence, reminding her of all the dreams she had harbored in secret, all the wild hopes that would soon be buried beneath the respectability of an arranged marriage. When the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Mr. Whitmore's arrival, Clara felt her stomach drop like a stone thrown into a deep well. She watched from her window as the portly man dismounted his horse with obvious difficulty, his expensive suit already wilted from the Texas heat. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, his pale hands gesturing as he spoke to her father on the porch below. Clara's fingers found the lace curtain, gripping it until her knuckles turned white, as if holding onto the fabric could somehow anchor her to this moment, before everything changed forever. The sound of their laughter drifted up to her room, casual and comfortable, the sound of men discussing property and profit, while her entire future hung in the balance. The blue dress felt like a shroud, as her mother fastened the pearl buttons with practiced efficiency, each small closure sealing Clara deeper into her predetermined fate. "You look beautiful, darling," her mother whispered, but her voice carried an undertone of sadness that suggested she understood more than she was willing to admit. Clara stared at herself in the mirror, seeing not a bride-to-be, but a sacrifice dressed in silk and pearls, prepared for an altar she had never chosen to approach. The woman in the reflection looked older somehow, as if the weight of expectation had aged her overnight, stealing something precious and irreplaceable from her eyes. When her mother's hands settled on her shoulders, Clara felt the gesture like chains, loving but unbreakable, binding her to a life that felt like death. The parlor had been transformed into a stage for her performance, with fresh flowers arranged to mask the scent of her fear, and the good china displayed like props in a play she had never auditioned for. Mr. Whitmore rose when she entered, his small eyes taking inventory of her, like a man appraising livestock, and Clara felt something wild and desperate claw at her chest. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice oily with satisfaction, "you are even more lovely than your father described." The words felt like hands touching her without permission, and Clara found herself thinking of Jacob's calloused fingers, honest and gentle, so different from the soft, grasping hands that would soon claim ownership of her body and soul. The engagement dinner stretched before Clara like a road leading to her own execution, each course served with the solemnity of a last meal. Mr. Whitmore dominated the conversation with stories of his business ventures and property acquisitions, speaking of cattle and land deals with the same casual tone he used when discussing their upcoming marriage. Clara pushed food around her plate, her appetite lost somewhere between the soup course and the moment he had casually mentioned that she would, of course, be expected to produce an heir within the first year. Her parents nodded approvingly at everything he said, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of a deal well made, while Clara felt herself disappearing piece by piece with each passing minute. Through the dining room window she could see the bunkhouse where Jacob slept, a small light flickering in one of the windows, like a beacon calling her home to herself. When Mr. Whitmore excused himself to smoke cigars with her father on the porch, Clara seized her chance like a drowning woman grasping for air. She slipped through the kitchen and out the back door, her heart hammering against her ribs as she made her way toward the stables through the gathering dusk. The night air felt cool against her flushed skin, carrying the scent of hay and horses and something indefinably wild that made her blood sing with possibility. She found Jacob in the far stall, brushing down a mare with long, rhythmic strokes, his movements hypnotic in the lamplight. When he looked up and saw her standing there in her engagement dress, something raw and hungry flashed across his face, and Clara felt her knees go weak with the power of it. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and his hands had already set aside the brush, already reaching for her before his mind could stop them. Clara stepped closer, close enough to smell the leather and sweat and something uniquely masculine that made her head spin with want. "I know," she whispered, but she was already moving into his arms, already pressing herself against the solid warmth of his chest. "But I couldn't stay in that house another minute, listening to him plan our life like I'm not even there." Jacob's arms came around her with desperate tenderness, holding her like she was something precious and fragile that might shatter if he held too tight. "Clara," He breathed against her hair, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a curse all at once. The hay beneath them was soft and sweet-smelling, a bed made of golden dreams and stolen moments that would have to last a lifetime. Jacob's hands trembled as they traced the pearl buttons of her dress, each small fastening a barrier between them and the truth they both knew, but couldn't speak aloud. "This is madness," he whispered, but his fingers continued their gentle exploration, mapping the territory of her skin like a man memorizing a landscape he would never see again. Clara arched beneath his touch, her body responding to sensations that were both foreign and achingly familiar, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this moment of recognition. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the stable walls, creating a world that existed outside of time and consequence, where only the language of touch and breath and whispered endearments had any meaning. When footsteps echoed across the yard, they broke apart like guilty children, Clara's hands flying to her disheveled hair while Jacob stepped protectively in front of her. "Miss Clara?" Her father's voice carried across the darkness, sharp with concern and growing suspicion. "Are you out here?" Clara's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it could be heard from the house, and she pressed her hand to her chest as if she could somehow muffle the sound of her own terror. Jacob's eyes met hers in the lamplight, and she saw her own desperation reflected there, along with something else, a fierce protectiveness that made her feel both cherished and terrified. "Go," he whispered urgently, but his hand lingered on her arm for one precious second longer than necessary. "Before he finds us together." Clara smoothed her skirts and stepped out of the stall with as much dignity as she could muster, her legs unsteady beneath her as she walked toward her father's approaching figure. "I was just checking on Moonbeam," she called out, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. She seemed restless earlier. Her father's eyes narrowed as he took in her flushed face and slightly disheveled appearance, and Clara felt the weight of his suspicion settle over her like a heavy blanket. Behind her, she could hear Jacob moving quietly in the stall, and she prayed that her father's attention would remain focused on her rather than investigating the shadows where her heart had just been broken and remade in the space of stolen minutes. The wedding dress hung in Clara's wardrobe like a white spectre, its silk folds catching the morning light with an accusatory gleam that made her stomach turn. 3 days had passed since the engagement dinner, 3 days of careful charades and stolen glances across the yard, 3 days of dying a little more with each sunrise that brought her closer to a fate she couldn't escape. Her mother bustled around the room, adjusting the veil and chattering about flowers and music, her voice bright with the kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as Clara that this was a joyous occasion. Clara sat at her dressing table like a condemned woman, watching her reflection practice smiles that never reached her eyes, while her heart bled for the man who worked just beyond her window, close enough to touch, but forever beyond her reach. The sound of raised voices from the yard below drew Clara to her window, where she saw her father gesturing angrily at Jacob near the corral. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in both men's postures, the way they stood like adversaries preparing for battle, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. Jacob's hat was pushed back, revealing the hard line of his jaw, and when he spoke, Clara could see her father's face darken with rage. She pressed her ear to the glass, trying to catch fragments of their conversation, but the words were lost in the wind that carried only the promise of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. When her father pointed toward the road leading away from the ranch, Clara's heart stopped beating entirely, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "He's been dismissed," her mother said quietly from behind her, and Clara spun around to find her standing in the doorway with an expression of profound sadness. "Your father caught him, looking at you in ways that weren't appropriate for a hired hand." The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one driving her deeper into a despair so complete it felt like drowning. "He's to be gone by sunset," her mother continued, her voice gentle but implacable. "It's for the best, darling. You'll see that someday. But Clara was already moving, already pushing past her mother and down the stairs, her feet carrying her toward a confrontation she knew would destroy everything, but couldn't prevent herself from seeking. She found Jacob in the bunkhouse, throwing his few possessions into a worn leather saddlebag, with movements that spoke of barely controlled fury. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, something broke in his expression, and Clara felt her own composure shatter like glass. "Don't go," she whispered, the words torn from her throat like pieces of her soul. "Please, Jacob, don't leave me here." He crossed the small room in 2 strides, his hands framing her face with desperate tenderness, his thumbs brushing away tears. She didn't realize she was crying. "I have to," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your father made it clear what would happen if I stayed." The unspoken threat hung between them like a blade, sharp and deadly, and Clara understood that her father's protection came with a price that Jacob couldn't afford to pay. "Come with me," Jacob said suddenly, his hands tightening on her face as if he could hold her there through sheer force of will. "We could leave tonight. Ride north to Colorado or California. Start over where nobody knows us." For a moment, Clara allowed herself to imagine it. The two of them riding through the darkness toward a horizon that held only possibility, leaving behind the weight of expectation and duty for a life built on love and choice. But even as the dream bloomed in her heart, reality crashed down around her like a collapsing building. "My family," she whispered, "they would never forgive me. And you, they would hunt you down like an animal." The truth of it settled between them like a death sentence, and Clara saw her own hopelessness reflected in Jacob's eyes. When the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Clara stood at her window and watched Jacob lead his horse from the stable. He moved with the careful dignity of a man who had lost everything but refused to be broken by it, his shoulders straight despite the weight of defeat that pressed down on him like a physical force. At the gate, he turned back toward the house, and even from a distance, Clara could feel the pull of his gaze finding her window. She pressed her palm against the glass, a gesture so small and futile it might have been invisible, but Jacob's hand rose to touch the brim of his hat in a farewell that felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Then he was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk like a dream she had been foolish enough to believe could last forever, leaving Clara alone with the white dress that waited to transform her into someone else's wife.